try to just do a sort of a speed read of the whole chapter as fast as I can without too much detail, pointing out some issues and some topics for discussion so that we can have a longer period of discussion, because I think there are some major issues which are set up in this chapter. But I do want to begin by kind of pointing out something which is, I think, very significant. As I said in the discussion last week, you have to think about the totality. And one of the part of the totality that Marx doesn't mention in his footnote, but which is obviously crucial, the institutional arrangements and institutional conditions which prevail. And if I ask you the question, how much of this chapter depends on the factory inspector's reports? It's huge. And there's an interesting question which arose in the working day chapter as well, is why would a state which is dominated by capital and landlords actually produce this vast amount of information about what is going on in the factories? And it's not only the factory inspectors, it's the public health officials, everything else. There was something going on in the British state, right, which was really very special. And one of the reasons that Marx could use the British case was not only because industrial capitalism was more advanced in Britain than it was anywhere else, and therefore Marx could say basically to people in Europe and so on that when you're looking at the English case, you're looking at your future. So it's not only that, but also that it has this immense amount of information, and the state apparatus that is collecting this information. And by and large, one of the themes in the chapter, Marx says at one point, is that, you know, the British state was collecting information and passing laws at a pretty frantic rate. The problem was the laws were never enforced. And this is, again, something that's rather special, rather unique. I mean, if you took out all of the materials from the factory inspector's report, you'd have a much shorter chapter, right? And a lot of the insights Marx relies upon is from that. Marx himself doesn't get into factories. As far as I know, he never really went into one. Of course, he had an advantage. He could talk to Engels, and did obviously talk to Engels a great deal about what was going on in the factory system in Manchester and so on. So he was well informed about it, but personally, most of his information is coming from the factory inspectors. So this long chapter then has a number of important headings. The first one we dealt with last time, which is about the general development of a single machine into a system of machines which creates the factory, and Marx gives this graphic description that innovations in one sector call for innovations in another, even the indirect innovations which are necessary in transport and communications and systems of ocean liners and things like that, so that innovation has to be across the board. But the main theme here, and I think this is something we ought to really pay attention to throughout, is how capital came, as he puts it, to develop a technological and organizational framework that was suited to its own distinctive mode of production. That up until this point, it had relied upon a technological and organizational framework drawn from a preceding period. But this is, as he says, the way in which capital came to create. Now, if that is the case, and any mode of production is at some point obligated to come up with its distinctive technology appropriate to its own system of production, then this actually says something about the task of socialism. And one of the themes that is within this chapter is to what extent is the technological and organizational form that has arisen under capitalism appropriate for building an alternative kind of society, i.e. a socialist society. After all, Lenin, when he was faced with the problem of what to do after the revolution, was keenly aware that you needed a high productivity labor process in order to get the materials to be able to fight the war and all of that kind of thing. And he said, what form of organization is it that can do that? And his answer was the Fordist factory. So actually he became a proponent of a kind of a socialist version of Fordism, because it was only in that way that you could get the productivity that might be needed to create the possibility for a socialist society. Deng Xiaoping, when he went into the market, basically said, we've got a productivity problem. We can only solve it by, in effect, developing the technologies and the organizational forms which are typical of a capitalist society. So there's an interesting kind of question here about any transition in the mode of production. If, as Marx says, capital at some point had to create the transitions, and the factory system was, if you like, the form of the mode of production, then what will happen in terms of a socialist perspective? This is coupled also with the other question, which is Marx is kind of saying, okay, capital has uncovered its distinctive mode of production. Right now, what Marx describes in here would be a very good description of factory labor conditions in Bangladesh, in China, but it's not such a good description of labor processes in this country right now. There is, in this chapter, a kind of tendency on Marx's part to be a bit teleological. That is to say that ultimately the factory system is going to drive out everything else. When he was writing, he said it clearly hasn't happened because there's hybrid forms, there's mixed forms, and the rest of it, and there are areas of the economy that can't be organized along the factory line, and there's also the question of can you industrialize and turn agriculture into factories. And at that time, Marx was skeptical about the possibility of being able to do that. But if the labor processes have changed, and if the mode of production, in the sense that Marx is describing it here, is no longer dominant, or is actually much more mixed than Marx describes, then what kind of society are we living in? Are we living under capitalism, or what? See what I'm saying? That if the technological changes have gone in a certain direction, and there have been times when you get a sort of kind of technological utopianism. The early years of the internet had the idea, we're going to build a completely different society, different social relations, this kind of thing. Technology is going to actually create an alternative. We don't even have to think about socialism, because it's going to be an alternative society, which is going to be built on this alternative technology. 20 years ago, 15 years ago, people really seriously thought that was a possibility. I don't think people think it's much of a possibility now, given, the way in which that area of the economy has evolved. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. But these are some of the questions which I think get posed by this insistence that any mode of production has to come up with a technological and organizational form which is appropriate to its specific conditions. Marx then talks in the second section about the transfer of value to the machine, and that brings up the issue of moral depreciation of fixed capital. That is, the fixed capital which how do you account for the value going into the machine, that the machine imparts to the commodities? What about a situation in which new technological innovations come along and render older machines obsolete? What do you do about that? Well, one of the things you do is you make sure that the value of the machine is recuperated as soon as possible. And the way you do that is in many instances to try to employ the machine 24 hours a day, which means that there's a completely different labor demand, which is 24 hours labor, which leads to a shift system and the like, but which also presses capital to extend the length of the working day. So Marx's kind of position about John Stuart Mill's question, where he starts the chapter saying, John Stuart Mill kind of kept on wondering why it was the technology that was supposed to lighten the load of labor always ended up making the labor conditions worse. And Marx's answer is, well, it's obvious, because the aim of the technology is not to lighten the load of labor, it's to produce more surplus value. And if you can produce surplus value out of it, then, of course, it's going to be mobilized in such a way as to make the lot of the laborer worse. And the example of what happened to the internet and information technology and all the rest of it, I think is a very good example also of a situation which starts out where the question is, why can't this liberate us, and gets turned into something else, is because the aim of capital in deploying all of that was to squeeze out more surplus value somehow or other. And to the degree that it's managed to do so, it has perverted a particular technology to capital's ends, capitalist purposes. Then Marx goes on to talk about the effects on the worker. And the worker is, first off, it's possible to employ women and children, so family labor can substitute for individual labor, which is actually a very important process. That leads to the creation of all sorts of structures of labor supply, a gang system, a family labor system, all the rest of it, with exploitation of women and children being accelerated. We also get the prolongation of the working day, which is partly about the moral depreciation problem. But there is, I think, a very, very important dichotomy which I want to mark, which is that when Marx starts off, he is very clear that machines do not produce value. I've forgotten exactly where he said that. But it's in the beginning of his argument, he says, the machine is a form of constant capital, therefore where exactly did he say that? This always happens to me. I kind of know he says it somewhere. Where do you say it? Exactly. 509? Okay. So on 509 he says, 509 he says, machinery, like every other component of constant capital, creates no new value. Okay. Underline that, but then put it next to what he says on page 530, which is machinery produces relative surplus value. And we mentioned this last time. That is a contradiction in a sense, but you can see how it arises, but it's a very important one, and just always keep it in mind. Now, one of the things that's going to happen because of this is because machines produce relative surplus value, capitalists think machines produce value. And capitalists therefore fetishize the machine as a source of value and surplus value, when in fact to fetishize it as a false source of value is a profound error, but it's understandable given that it can be a source of relative surplus value. So this then produces something. Then the third part is the intensification of labor. Marx hasn't talked about intensification of labor up until this point, but it's very important because you can increase surplus value not by extending the length of working day, but by increasing the intensity of labor. And to the degree that machinery gives you power over the intensity, it becomes a very important vehicle for producing relative surplus value via its capacity to create more in the way of intensity. And the intensity comes about in a number of ways. One is the question of the porosity of the working day, how much downtime is taken by laborers with their implements versus how much downtime is possible when a machine is working at a certain speed and a certain rhythm, and workers so you can control the intensity via the machine technology, and the worker is forced to greater and greater levels of intensity. And at some point, Marx then kind of points out that if you shorten the working day, you can actually compensate for that shortening of the working day by increasing the intensity. So there is an interesting question as to what the relationship is between absolute surplus value, extension of the working day, and increasing intensity. This then leads him into the consideration of the factory and the factory system. One of the things that happens with the factory system, and this is where there's a crucial kind of transformation takes place in the positionality of the laborer within the production process. The lifelong speciality, says on page 547, the lifelong speciality of handling the same tool now becomes the lifelong speciality of serving the same machine. Now, I want to emphasize this because this is contradicted later in the text. Machinery is misused in order to transform the worker from his very childhood into a part of a specialized machine. And then Marx talks about, at the same time, his helpless dependence upon the factory as a whole, and therefore upon the capitalist, is rendered complete. Here, as everywhere else, we must distinguish between the increased productivity, which is due to the development of the social process of production, and that which is due to the exploitation by the capitalists of that development. In handicrafts and manufacture, the worker makes use of a tool. In the factory, the machine makes use of him. There, the movements of the instrument of labor proceed from him. Here, it is the movements of the machine that he must follow. In manufacture, the workers are parts of a living mechanism. In the factory, we have a lifeless mechanism which is independent of the workers, who are incorporated into it as its living appendages. So the worker goes from having autonomy and independence to, in effect, being an appendage of the machine technology. And then Marx continues, factory work exhausts the nervous system to the uttermost. At the same time, it does away with the many-sided play of the muscles and confiscates every atom of freedom, both in bodily and intellectual activity. Even the lightening of the labor becomes an instrument of torture, since the machine does not free the worker from the work, but rather deprives the work itself of all content. This is the reintroduction of the theme of alienation, which Marx doesn't call alienation, but it's clearly that's what he's talking about. Every kind of capitalist production, insofar as it is not only a labor process but also capital's process of valorization, has this in common. But it is not the worker who employs the conditions of his work, but rather the reverse. The conditions of work employ the worker. However, it is only with the coming of machinery that this inversion first acquires a technical and palpable reality. Owing to its conversion into an automaton, the instrument of labor confronts the worker during the labor process in the shape of capital. Dead labor, which dominates and soaks up living labor power. Furthermore, and this is also important, the separation of the intellectual faculties of the production process from manual labor and the transformation of those faculties into powers exercised by capital over labor is, as we have already shown, finally completed by large-scale industry erected on the foundation of machinery. So the worker becomes an appendage of the machine. The worker is not only turned in physically into an automaton that does what the machine commands and demands. Mental capacities, which were once very important in the life of the worker in terms of knowledge of the production system, are taken away from the worker, and mental capacities become a power of capital over labor. This is very important, because what Marx is saying is that this reconfiguration gives the power of mental capacities to the capitalist, and the laborer is supposed to not to think. That's how Marx is putting it right here. The special skill, he says, of each individual machine or operator who has now been deprived of all significance vanishes in an infinitesimal quantity in the face of the science, the gigantic natural forces and the mass of social labor embodied in the system of machinery, which together with these three forces constitutes the power of the master. This master, therefore, in whose mind the machinery and his monopoly of it are inseparably united, contemptuously tells his hands whenever he comes into conflict with them, and then there's what the owner says to the factory operatives. It's interesting about the term hands. Charles Dickens wrote this fantastic thing about when he finally wrote a book about industrial labor, about Coketown and all the rest of it. He kind of says, the owner's called the people hands because he wishes they didn't have heads and stomachs. Which is sort of, a typical Dickens thing, but actually it's a very important thing. I mean, this is what Marx, in effect, is saying, right? And he's using this word hands in inverted commas to signal that there's something awful about this configuration. Now, all of this leads into the fifth section, which is, I think, a very interesting one, the struggle between worker and machine, where Marx takes on the question of the Luddite movement, which is machine-breaking movement. I mean, workers were so pissed off at the sort of labor conditions which they were encountering through machine technology that in the middle of the night they would try and get somewhere and they'd smash the machines. And so there was this machine breaking going on because machines were seen as the enemy of the autonomy of working class and the bane of working class life. But Marx starts off by pointing out, and here's where we start to get the ambiguity, where he says that of course workers were revolting against the machine. But, he says on 554, it took both time and experience before the workers learnt to distinguish between machinery and its employment by capital, and therefore to transfer their attacks from the material instruments of production to the form of society which utilizes those instruments. Who's the enemy here? The machine or the capitalist that is using the machine in a certain kind of way? And there is, by the way, some evidence now by economic historians that throughout this whole period when machine breaking became quite a significant movement, that workers initially just smashed machines, but after a bit started to smash only those machines in those factories where the owner was being particularly piggish about their deployment. And so there was, it turns out, an actual shift in consciousness as to what the enemy was throughout this period. Now, of course, what this does is to project the whole kind of question of technological change into the cauldron of class struggle. How is technological change actually being used as a vehicle of class struggle? And Marx takes this up and so on 562 he says, I think, a very important thing. Machinery, he says, does not just act as a superior competitor to the worker, always on the point of making him superfluous. It is a power inimical to him, and capital proclaims this fact loudly and deliberately, as well as making use of it. It is the most powerful weapon for suppressing strikes, those periodic revolts of the working class against the autocracy of capital. According to Gaskell, the steam engine was from the very first an antagonist of human power, an antagonist that enabled the capitalist to tread underfoot the growing demands of the workers, which threatened to drive the infant factory system into crisis. It would be possible to write a whole history of the inventions made since 1830 for the sole purpose of providing capital with weapons against working class revolt. We would mention above all the self-acting mule. Now, this is an interesting thing. What is technological change about and why? It's about increasing labor productivity under capitalism. It's not about improving human well-being, although the technology people always say it is. It's about increasing productivity, and it's also about disempowering the worker. And it's interesting, there was a rather well-known figure in Second Empire Paris who was an industrialist who wrote copiously about the working class and what the workers were about, and in the course of writing about this, he talked about his ambitions in innovation. And he had a number of principles that guided what he was going to do in terms of innovation. One of them was to open up the production process to disaggregation in the way that Marx talks about, so that you could get more scientific and technological about it. The second was he wanted to improve, obviously, the productivity of labor that was associated with the machine. But his third principle was that he wanted to have machinery that helped disempower labor. I mean, he was very explicit about it. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do. I want a kind of machine technology, which means that the labor has less power. Now, we've actually been through a kind of whole era of technological innovation in manufacturing. What has it done to the power of labor, both in the labor process, but also in the market? Marx earlier has talked about one of the things that machine does is throw people out of work. So if the labor movement's getting bolshy, you kind of say, okay, we'll have unemployment and we'll throw you out of work. So a machine technology that throws lots of people out of work deals with that. And actually, historically, if you look at the kind of way in which deindustrialization occurred in the United States and Europe, what was it doing? It was driving people out of work. And as they're out of work, you get a high level of unemployment. So in this country, the Reagan recession of 1982, when unemployment went up to around 10, 15%. And at that point, you were going to break the power of labor, as Reagan did by breaking the PATCO, the Air Traffic Controllers Union, and fighting against labor and basically disempowering labor. So there's a technological kind of line to this, that deindustrialization has actually disempowered labor in crucial ways, and the introduction of flexible specialization, which actually some leftists back in the 1980s thought was going to be a liberatory technology because everybody likes greater flexibility of employment possibilities. But that flexibility was used to actually manipulate and destroy union power and lead into precarious temporary labor structures and, the gig economy and all the rest of it. So the technological change, as far as Marx is concerned, cannot be divorced from the conditions of class struggle, because it's disempowerment of the labor movement and the laboring classes, both in the labor process but also in the market, which it becomes part and parcel of what this technological dynamism is all about. So that this section, which is dealing with the Luddites directly, also has within it the whole kind of question of the role of technological innovation being weaponized by capital as a serious weapon of class struggle, and Marx is opening up that kind of question. Now, chapter 6 is a longish chapter about the compensation theory, and capitalists kind of often said machine technology while it may throw people out of work here, it actually has compensating effects such that the aggregate unemployment is zero, or the effects on unemployment are zero. This was the compensation theory. That we introduce technological change, and yes, people are thrown out of work, but in being thrown out of work, you liberate means of subsistence for another segment of the work of workers to take it up. At the same time, because of the technological change, there's going to be a greater demand for raw materials, and so he starts to look at some of the questions of where the raw materials are coming from, and that then leads into some considerations of what the impact of all of this is. And the theory of compensation then kind of said, well, okay, you need people to build the machines. So you've got extra employment in the machine tool industry. You've got extra employment, people producing the raw materials and in extractivism. So all of this compensates in such a way. That was the theory. And Marx considered that's rubbish. What in effect you get is a throwing out of people of production. They sit upon the market, it depresses the price of labor, all the rest of it, and then maybe they're brought back in as the system expands. So he doesn't say that there's no expansion possibility and that the new expansions are not important, but he does say that the theory of compensation is just nonsense. But the increased demand for raw materials means something, and he here introduces a kind of a thing on the side, which is 578, 579, and he says that through the deployment of machinery and the increasing productivity, you're going to need an extra supply of raw materials. And then he kind of says this produces large-scale, the general conditions of production appropriate to large-scale industry, this is on 579, have been established. This mode of production acquires an elasticity, a capacity for sudden extension by leaps and bounds, which comes up against no barriers but those presented by the availability of raw materials and the extent of sales outlets. So that there's problems, if you like, both in terms of supplying this but also finding markets for the increased output. On the one hand, the immediate effect of machinery is to increase the supply of raw material. Thus, for example, the invention of the cotton gin increased the production of cotton. On the other hand, the cheapness of the articles produced by machinery and the revolution in the means of transport and communication provide the weapons for the conquest of foreign markets. So suddenly we're getting foreign markets. By ruining handicraft of finished articles in other countries, and Marx is referring here mainly to India, machinery forcibly converts them into fields for the production of its raw material. Thus, India was compelled to produce cotton, wool, hemp, jute, and indigo for Great Britain. By constantly turning workers into supernumeraries, large-scale industry in all countries where it has taken root spurs on rapid increases in emigration and the colonization of foreign lands, which are thereby converted into settlements for growing the raw material of the mother country, just as Australia, for example, was converted into a colony for growing wool. A new international division of labor springs up, one suited to the requirements of the main industrial countries, and it converts one part of the globe into a chiefly agricultural field of production for supplying the other part, which remains a preeminently industrial field. This revolution is linked with far-reaching changes in agriculture, which we need not discuss further at this point. Marx is basically talking here about, the expansion of this system is going to lead to a new international division of labor, colonialism, imperialism, an increase of extractivism, what we now call extractivism, from many parts of the world, and that therefore the theory of compensation inadequately attacks and deals with the dynamics of expansion of a highly productive system. So the industrialization that Marx was seeing in Britain produced the requirement that new sources of raw materials must be set up and plundered, at the same time as new markets must be found. So that therefore, and what's interesting about this is, there is a perpetual force, if you like, making for globalization, what we now call globalization. And actually, if you want a good theory of globalization, you go to the Communist Manifesto and some parts of Capital, because Marx says, basically, the creation of the world market is inherent in the dynamics of capitalism. And everybody kind of thought globalization started to occur in 1972 or something like that. Well, Marx is saying, going to say, no, it was there in the 1840s, it was there in the 1850s, and the British conquest of India had everything to do with finding new markets. So you destroyed the handicraft industry and you marketed all your cotton goods into India. At the same time as India had to pay for all of those goods, how did it pay for it? Well, cotton, jute, all the rest of it. So this is, if there is a theory of translation of the dynamics of this system, it cannot be covered with some simple theory of compensation. It has to be looked at in terms of this dynamic explosion. This then leads into a series of discussions of exactly what happens within, and we're in this seventh section, which is about really crises in the cotton industry, where Marx goes over in considerable detail to the way in which the cotton industry was up and down, and in a sense he's kind of saying it's almost invariably the case that capitalist production is not going to expand in a smooth kind of expansion. It's likely to be cyclical, and that there will be phases of very rapid expansion, in a sense talking about the formation of business cycles. But it's interesting, this section on 7 on the repulsion and attraction of workers, that you're talking about business cycles in time, but you're also talking about geographical spread in terms of the colonization of the Indian market in a very specific way, and the creation of a new international division of labor. So the factory system cannot sort of simply serve its locality. And it has this dynamism of phases of expansion, but also it's a geographical expansion too. Earlier he had, I missed out on something which is rather important earlier in the theory of compensation, which is that the expansions entail not only a possible expansion of the proletariat, but also an expansion of the capitalist class, and the requirement, which is a very important theme in Volume 3 of Capital, which is that you're creating surplus. You need to find a way to invest it. The machine and factory system is creating surplus hand over fist. Where is the surplus going to be reinvested, and how is it going to be reinvested? Well, some of the surplus is going to go to increasing the standard of living of the bourgeoisie, which in itself creates a new market, and so you can realize more value by marketing to them. Then you need the world market, but you can't get to the world market unless you invest in the construction of canals, docks, tunnels, bridges, and so on. So entirely new branches of production, creating new fields of labor, are also formed. And this is not Marx saying this is not a theory of compensation, but it's an impact of this dynamism of industrial capitalism. And then Marx talks about the formation of new industries. The chief industries of this kind are at present gasworks, telegraphy, photography, steam navigation, and railways. So, the expansion of the factory system cannot continue without an expansion of infrastructural investments, which creates entirely new fields for investment, which then actually creates new structures, new social structures within society. So this is Marx then in section 8 says, well, let's look at the revolutionary impact of large-scale industry on manufacture, handicrafts, and domestic industry. Now here he realizes that this machine technology is not going to take over everywhere simultaneously, and that there are lagging areas, and that in those lagging areas, however, competition from the machine sector tends to put intense pressure on manufacturing structures to engage in practices of exploitation which are kind of really savage, but that it is possible for alternative forms of organization to persist. So on 5 number 1 he talks about the factory worker, the workers engaged in manufacture, and the handicraftsman whom it concentrates in large masses at one spot and directly commands. Capital also sets another army in motion by means of invisible threads. The outworkers in the domestic industries who live in the large towns, as well as being scattered over the countryside. And he then talks about workers, the dispersal of the workers, but how this is to some degree advantageous for capital. As he says, in the so-called domestic industries, which is the putting out system where you got the peasant huts, people working in peasant huts to do the weaving, and then you collected the woven materials at the end of the month. He says, in the so-called domestic industries, exploitation is still more shameless than in modern manufacture because the workers' power of resistance declines with their dispersal. Now, this is an interesting kind of comment because there have been times when capital, in order to prevent worker organization, is engaged in tactics of geographical dispersal. And actually, one of the things that tended to happen after 1980 or so was the dispersal of a lot of activity geographically, so that organization of labor became much more difficult. And he says the workers' power of resistance declines with their dispersal because a whole series of plundering parasites insinuate themselves between the actual employer and the worker he employs. So this is about what happens within domestic industries. And he then talks about the perpetuation of the modern, of manufacturing of the sort he described in the previous chapter, and what happens, and he then talks about modern domestic industry, which in his case he talks about lace making and the like. And then he talks about the transitions which are occurring in modern manufacture, and how the transitions are orchestrated, and he introduces the technology of the sewing machine, which is very interesting. I mean, you can either set up sewing machines in vast factories, so you have just a vast factory of sewing machines and people sewing, or you can actually subcontract out to sort of family labor and say, get to work on your sewing machine in the basement, and this kind of thing. So the sewing machine has been a very, very important vehicle for both concentrated and dispersed systems of manufacturing. Marx then finally talks about after the transition, he starts to talk about the various transitional forms, and this brings him to talk a little bit more about the nature of the factory, factory system, general nature of the factory system. So there's an interesting sort of passage on 607. He says, but though the Factory Acts ripen the material elements necessary for the conversion of the manufacturing system into the factory system, yet at the same time, because they make it necessary to lay out a greater amount of capital, they hasten the decline of the small masters and the concentration of capital. Now this is an interesting observation because it's very often the case that large, heavy intervention and regulatory reform often has an adverse impact upon the small producers. Only the big producers are really positioned to be able to deal with the regulatory system. And the result is that the imposition of more and more state regulation often has the effect of centralizing production and actually producing monopoly power. As he says, apart from the purely technical impediments, which can be removed by technical means, the irregular habits of the workers themselves obstruct the regulation of the hours of labour. This is especially the case where piece wages predominate, and where loss of time in one part of the day or week can be made good by subsequent overtime or by night work, a process which brutalizes the adult worker and ruins his wife and children. He then talks about the whole kind of question of seasonal labour. But then there comes another interesting observation when he kind of says that when you've got a situation where there's a periodicity of favourable seasons of the year for navigation or favourable seasons of fashion, when new fashions are going to be demanded, and the sudden placing of large orders that have to be executed in the shortest possible time, the habit of giving such orders becomes more frequent with the extension of railways and telegraphs, and he then talks, in effect, about the creation of what we now call a just-in-time system. That to the degree that communication structures are set up, it becomes possible to jump more rapidly to deal with immediate demand. So if there's an immediate demand for something, you can send it via the telegraph and say, I need more of this equipment or more of this raw material, and the raw material can be at your disposal within a few days instead of months or something of that kind. So that in effect, what this does is it allows producers to actually economize on the inventories they hold. That is, you don't have to sit there with a vast stock of cotton over a long period of time. You can, in order to engage in sort of power loom weaving, you can simply sort of say, okay, we need this amount of power loom weaving now. The cotton can come from somewhere else, and we order the cotton as we need it. So you start to get the organization of a primitive kind of logistics system within the industry, and Marx is talking about that. But one of the important aspects of this is, again, the greater coordination which is existing in society. The communication structure, the commodity chain, which as we now talk about, or the value chain, and then the kind of the ability to be very flexible in relationship to the demands, the fluctuating and often fickle demands of the market. So Section 9 is on the health and education clauses of the Factory Acts. It's clear, says Marx, that the free trade dogma, and he's going to be ironic when he says on 611, he says, here is yet another dazzling vindication of the free trade dogma, that in a society of mutually antagonistic interests, each individual furthers the common welfare by seeking his own personal advantage. Part of what Marx is talking about is individual capitalists working in their own self-interest actually do a tremendous job of screwing up the whole system. And the aggregate effects are disastrous. The aggregate effects in the working day, you recall, are disastrous. The aggregate effects of individual maximizing behavior in the world of factory labor is also disastrous, not simply socially and politically, but even technically from the standpoint of the dynamics of capital accumulation. So he's going to talk here about the Factory Act and the education clauses and things of that kind. And on 614, he mentions Robert Owen, where he suddenly realizes or introduces the idea that Robert Owen was a factory owner. Robert Owen, however, started to try to create a benevolent form of factory labor. And Marx comments that Robert Owen has shown us in detail the germ of the education of the future is present in the factory system. So we've been dealing with this awful, incoherent system, and here's Marx saying the germ of the education of the future is present in this factory system. This education will, in the case of every child over a given age, combine productive labor with instruction and gymnastics, not only as one of the methods of adding to the efficiency of production, but as the only method of producing fully developed human beings. So we suddenly got this concept coming up in this of the possibility within the industrial system of transforming it into a system which would become a method of producing fully developed human beings. As he says, as we have seen, large-scale industry sweeps away by technical means the division of labor characteristic of manufacture, under which each man is bound hand and foot for a life to a single specialized operation. At the same time, the capitalist form of large-scale industry reproduces the same division of labor in a still more monstrous shape, in the factory proper, by converting the worker into a living appendage of the machine. Now, we've seen this back before. And everywhere outside the factory by the sporadic use of machinery and machine workers, or by the introduction of the labor of women, children, and unskilled men as a new foundation for the division of labor. The contradiction, he says, between the division of labor under manufacture and the essential character of large-scale industry makes itself forcibly felt. It appears, for example, in the frightful fact that a great part of the children employed in modern factories and manufactures are from their earliest years riveted to the most simple manipulations and exploited for years without being taught a single kind of skill that would afterwards make them of use, even in the same factory. So this is his complaint. But at the same time, what we start to see is the disaggregation of the industrial labor process into something different. And he talks on the next page, on 616, about the situation in which, right down to the 18th century, the different trades were called mysteries, mystères, into whose secrets none but those initiated by a profession and their practical experience could penetrate. So it was an art. Production was an art, a mystery. If people were successful in production, it's because of their intelligence and their capacities. But large-scale industry, he said, tore aside the veil that concealed from men their own social process of production and turned the various spontaneously divided branches of productions into riddles, not only to outsiders, but even to the initiated. Its principle, which is to view each process of production in and for itself and to resolve it into its constituent elements without looking first at the ability of the human hand to perform the new processes, brought into existence the whole of the modern science of technology. Again, this is a knowledge structure which is now being converted. This is a conversion of mental conceptions of the world and mental understandings of the world. The various unconnected and petrified forms of the social production process were now dissolved into conscious and planned applications of natural science, divided up systematically in accordance with a particularly useful effect aimed at it in each case. Similarly, technology discovered the few grand fundamental forms of motion, which, despite all the diversity of the instruments used, apply necessarily to every productive action of the human body, just as the science of mechanics is not misled by the immense complication of modern machinery into viewing this as anything other than the constant reappearance of the same simple mechanical processes. And he then goes on to say, modern industry never views or treats the existing forms of a production process as the definitive one. Its technical basis is therefore revolutionary, whereas all earlier modes of production were essentially conservative. By means of machinery, chemical processes, and other methods, it is continually transforming not only the technical basis of production, but also the functions of the worker and the social combinations of the labour process. At the same time, it thereby also revolutionises the division of labour within society and incessantly throws masses of capital and of workers from one branch of production to another. Thus, large-scale industry, by its very nature, necessitates variation of labour, fluidity of functions, and the mobility of the worker in all directions. But on the other hand, in its capitalist form, it reproduces the old division of labour with its ossified particularities. We have seen how this absolute contradiction does away with all repose, all fixity, and all security, as far as the worker's life security is concerned. How it constantly threatens, by taking away the instruments of labour, to snatch from his hands the means of subsistence, and by suppressing his specialised function, to make him superfluous. And he talks about this, the reckless squandering of labour powers, and in the devastating effects of social anarchy. And then he goes on and says this. This is on 618. It's really interesting. This, he said, is the negative side. And it's very unlike Marx to say there's only one side to any question, as you probably by now have already realised. But if at present variation of labour imposes itself after the manner of an overpowering natural law, and with the blindly destructive action of a natural law that meets with obstacles everywhere, large-scale industry, through its very catastrophes, makes the recognition of variation of labour, and hence of the fitness of the worker for the maximum number of different kinds of labour, into a question of life and death. This is a completely different story from the one that we started out with. This possibility of varying labour must become a general law of social production, and the existing relations must be adapted to permit its realisation in practice. That monstrosity, the disposable working population held in reserve, in misery, for the changing requirements of capitalist exploitation, must be replaced by the individual man, who is absolutely available for the different kinds of labour required of him. The partially developed individual, who is merely the bearer of one specialised social function, must be replaced by the totally developed individual, for whom the different social functions are different modes of activity he takes up in turn. Now, this is a pretty extraordinary kind of conception. He says, industrial capitalism produces a situation which imprisons labour in the division of labour, and so to a lifelong task. It harnesses children in such a way that they can never be anything other than what. But at the same time, this industrial system is so unstable and is so dynamic and is so pressing always for something different, that it cannot actually survive on the basis of a labour force that only can do one thing. It wants a labour force that can switch from one thing or another, or has a talent or a capacity in which they can move very easily from this branch of industry to that branch of industry, or from that particular kind of task to another task. That switching around is very difficult to imagine if the labour force is not literate, if it is not, to some degree, trained and knowledgeable in terms of simple mechanical principles, and can therefore adapt itself rapidly to alternative tasks. And this is, as Marx is concerned, he doesn't call it the positive side, but it is the positive side. So it has this negative side in terms of its industrial organisation and its social relations and its mental conceptions. And then it puts demands on the labour force, which mean that labour force has to actually take on a different character. This carries over, then, to some other observations. That the children of the workers must receive a certain amount of instruction in technology and in the practical handling of the various implements of labour. Though the Factory Act, that first and meagre concession wrung from capital, is limited to combining elementary education with work in the factory, there can be no doubt that, with the inevitable conquest of political power by the working class, technological education, both theoretical and practical, will take its proper place in the schools of the workers. There is also no doubt that those revolutionary ferments whose goal is the abolition of the old division of labour stand in diametrical contradiction with the capitalist form of production and the economic situation of the workers which corresponds to that form. However, the development of the contradictions of a given historical form of production is the only historical way in which it can be dissolved and then reconstructed on a new basis. A phrase which was the absolute summit of handicraft wisdom became sheer nonsense from the moment the watchmaker Watt invented the steam engine, the barber Arkwright, the Throstle, and the jeweller Fulton, the steamship. So he then talks about the factory legislation. But this has something else attached to it, which is an interesting sort of passage on 620, 621, where he starts to talk about the question of social reproduction. And I've mentioned, social reproduction is not Marx's forte. He doesn't always, pay attention to it, but he suddenly pays great attention to it about what's going on in terms of social relations within the household. Because education and the like is also partly located in the household. And we have to deal with the question of parental power and what's going on here. And so there's a discussion about this. Coming to the conclusion, however terrible and disgusting the dissolution of the old family ties within the capitalist system may appear, because remember, when women and children are now into the workforce, large-scale industry, by assigning an important part in socially organized processes of production outside the sphere of the domestic economy to women, young persons and children of both sexes, does nevertheless create a new economic foundation for a higher form of the family and of relations between the sexes. Again, Marx is kind of hypothesizing that the transformations occurring within the industrial system and the spread of different forms of factory labor and the perpetual revolutionary practices are going to have, in effect, a very powerful relation to the nature of family life and of relations between the sexes. Again, whether this is a reasonable assertion or not, is open to be debated, but Marx is clearly saying we have to see this relationally, that there's a relationality between the production system and issues of social reproduction. Now, what that relation is, he has a very simplistic view of it. But this also carries over to the question of how a collective working group is setting up. And we begin now to start to talk about collective labor as opposed to individual labor. It is also obvious, he says, that the collective working group is composed of individuals of both sexes and all ages must, under the appropriate conditions, turn into a source of humane development. Although in its spontaneously developed brutal capitalist form, the system works in the opposite direction and becomes a pestiferous source of corruption and slavery, since here the worker exists for the process of production and not the process of production for the worker. So he sees glimmers of possibility within this for some sort of redemptive transformation, both in the labor process but also in world of social reproduction, which is going to have some importance for how state interventions are eventually going to be captured, if you like, by workers so that they themselves start to become educated into the technologies which are required for a sophisticated form of production. There then follows a lot of quotations from the Factory Acts, goes on for pages and pages and pages, which I'm not going to go through, which is very much about for instance, the employment of women and children and all the rest of it. And this is my original comment of Marx wouldn't be able to have written all of this if the factory inspectors hadn't produced this vast archive of information. So So the end of this section, I think, is worthwhile paying a little attention to on 635, where he says, if the general extension of factory legislation to all trades for the purpose of protecting the working class, both in mind and body, has become inevitable, on the other hand, as we already pointed out, that extension hastens on the general conversion of numerous isolated small industries into a few combined industries carried on upon a large scale. It therefore accelerates the concentration of capital and the exclusive predominance of the factory system. It destroys both the ancient and transitional forms behind which the dominion of capital is still partially hidden, and replaces them with a dominion which is direct and unconcealed. By doing this, it also generalizes the direct struggle against its rule. While in each individual workshop it enforces uniformity, regularity, order, and economy, the result of the immense impetus given to technical improvements by the limitation and regulation of the working day is to increase the anarchy and proneness of catastrophe of capitalist production as a whole, the intensity of labor, competition of machinery with the worker. By the destruction of small-scale and domestic industries, it destroys the last resorts of the redundant population, thereby removing what was previously a safety valve for the whole social mechanism. By maturing the material conditions and the social combination of the process of production, it matures the contradictions and antagonisms of the capitalist form of that process, and thereby ripens both the elements of forming a new society and the forces tending towards the overthrow of the old one. So this is Marx talking about, how to coming out of this, what the prospects might be for utilizing some of the elements which are being necessarily created within this capitalist dynamic, to be using them for a progressive purpose. And the last section is about large-scale industry and agriculture, in which agriculture in Marx's time was sort of set aside. It was, of course, the largest employer of labor, and much of society was organized in terms of peasant-based production and the like. And Marx is talking about that situation, and recognizes here too that there is a transition in process, but it hasn't gone too far. As he says, at the same time, capital creates the material conditions for a new and higher synthesis, a union of agriculture and industry on the basis of the forms that have developed during the period of their antagonistic isolation. Capitalist production collects the population together in great centres and causes the urban population to achieve an ever-growing preponderance. This has two results. On the one hand, it concentrates the historical motive power of society. On the other hand, it disturbs the metabolic interaction between man and the earth. So suddenly we're back to the metabolic relation to nature. It prevents the return to the soil of its constituent elements consumed by men in the form of food and clothing. Hence, it hinders the operation of the eternal natural condition for the lasting fertility of the soil. Thus, it destroys at the same time the physical health of the urban worker and the intellectual life of the rural worker. But by destroying the circumstances surrounding that metabolism, which originated in a merely natural and spontaneous fashion, it compels its systematic restoration as a regulative law of social production and in a form adequate to the full development of the human race. The dispersal of the rural workers over large areas breaks their power of resistance, while concentration increases that of the urban workers. In modern agriculture, as in urban industry, the increase in the productivity and the mobility of labour is purchased at the cost of laying waste and debilitating labour power itself. Moreover, all progress in capitalist agriculture is a progress in the art not only of robbing the worker, but of robbing the soil. All progress in increasing the fertility of the soil for a given time is a progress towards ruining the more long-lasting sources of that fertility. The more a country proceeds from large-scale industry as the background of its development, as in the case of the United States, the more rapid is this process of destruction. Capitalist production, therefore, only develops the techniques and degree of combination of the social process of production by simultaneously undermining the original sources of all wealth, the soil and the worker. So Marx is saying that the depletion by capital of natural resources is equivalent to the depletion of the productive capacities of the working class through the processes of industrial production, extensions of the working day, increasing intensity, loss of autonomy, and that at the same time as there are these glimmers of hope through education, technological change, the fact that capital at a certain point is going to require a mass educated workforce which is fluid and capable of moving from one place to another in order to meet the needs of industrial production. Okay, it took rather longer than I wanted, but I wanted to emphasize, I think, there are these many issues that crop up in this chapter, which are very much about how we're going to respond today to artificial intelligence. In what ways artificial intelligence is going to have a transformative effect on our mental conceptions of the world? What's it going to do to the labor process? How is it going to be integrated into processes of social reproduction? What's the metabolic relation to nature look like? You know, there are all these kinds of questions which it seems to me Marx is getting at in this chapter. So even though some of it feels a bit dated and particular to Marx's own perspective, the general question he's raising and trying to deal with are general questions which are still with us and still need to be thought about, I think, fairly seriously. It's not that Marx has the answers, but that I think Marx is asking a right set of questions. And once we consider those questions, and ask about, you know, for instance, the depletion of the soil and so on, we find a whole series of very important issues which can be the center of considerable debate, and behind it is this kind of question. What kind of technology would we want to see developed? What is it that is actually giving us the trajectory of certain technologies? We know, I mean, just in terms of the history of medicine, that the medical technologies were, you know, way ahead for white working class, but white, bourgeois people. And so, you know, the technology of dealing with heart attacks is kind of way ahead, but the technology of dealing with sickle cell anemia or something like that, or distinctively proletarian problems is very defective. So there's always this class element. And there's always, within this realm of technological production, which we kind of tend to view as being kind of, well, it's just out there, it's happening all over the place. But behind it, there is a class project. And there may be a class project, let me put it like that, which deserves to be investigated and interrogated. Are the new technologies coming on board, new technologies which are beneficial to everyone, or do they have a class bias? Or, as in the case of the machines where Marx is talking about Luddite, is it a case that the technology is potentially valuable from the standpoint of a socialist future, but it gets perverted by capitalist social relations and capital into something completely different? Is that the problem? What is the nature of the technological problem right now? And what are the consequences of the pursuit of technological fixes which are constantly focused on increasing the productivity of labor? Because if you increase the productivity of labor, you are, as Marx pointed out, systematically committed to the expansion of the market and the expansion of the terrain from which you're going to draw your raw materials. That is, if, as has been argued in recent years, there's been an incredible burst of extractivism around the world, extractivism of raw materials around the world. The amount of copper being taken out of the ground has doubled since 2007. If that is the case, then you know, is that good? And that why is that occurring? And is that the nature of the capitalist dynamic? So Marx is, I think, setting up a framework in which to think about these things. So you could write an even longer chapter than Marx wrote. So if anybody's looking for a good dissertation topic, it would be, what would Marx write now if given the information that's available, you know? So I think there's something fascinating about this chapter, and it's a kind of a probing. It's a probing of all of these different questions. Let me throw it open to sort of get some of your reactions and what you think about some of these things and what you came up with in terms of thinking about the materials in this chapter. Who wants to go first? Yeah, let's back there.
Thanks again, David, for a fantastic talk. I'd like to take up that invitation and also what you said at the start and ask something that's been pondering me, that I've been pondering about. The concept that all value is created by labour, not by machines. I understand the logic of that, and it has a great logic to it. But then when I look at some of the new technology firms, Facebook, Google and so on, which creating massive profits and we're not basically heading towards creation of monopoly profits. And it's hard to look at that and see the value in there that's being, it's a function of labour of the employees or the contractors of the organisation. I understand, you can sort of think of it in terms of all the dead labour involved in the technology, the software and the hardware and so on, but I'm not sure whether, I don't find that totally convincing as to theorising about this new form of capital, and I'm wondering whether you've thought about that. Is it more like finance capital? Is it something totally different? Do we need... If Marx were writing a dissertation these days, how would he write about those sorts of things?
I often think about that. Well, let me say two preliminary things, okay. What Marx argues in Capital, by the time you get to the end of Volume 3, is that you're not looking at a situation where you have to discuss the individual production of value in a firm or anything else. That in effect, all productive labour produces value, and the image you can use it, and it all goes into one big pot. And then people draw from that, appropriate from that pot according to the capital they advance. And it's a kind of interesting thing. You contribute to the total value of society according to the labour you employ. You take from society according to the capital you advanced. Now, on that principle, anybody who advances a lot of capital but employs no labour can actually withdraw a great deal of the value. So the fact that you will find industrials and parts of the segments in the division of labour where very little labour is deployed, but you see a high rate of profit and all the rest of it, that is being achieved through this other mechanism, which is the equalisation of the rate of profit. So that's the first thing I would want to say. I don't think it covers entirely what you're talking about. The second thing is, okay, I think it's important to say something like Google. Where's the labour coming from? And of course, the point about Google is that it's actually going back to almost a putting out system. We're actually providing the labour, right? And we're providing... There's a massive amount of value which you and I and everybody else is creating by our use of Google. I mean, two things go on. We are in the condition of what Alvin Toffler called, we act as prosumers. That is, we are both consuming and producing at the same moment. When we get on Google and we are actually, we're providing Google with some information, which is vital. So there's the amount of value. So be careful about these firms that appear as if there's not much labor employed, but they're getting vast amount of profits, therefore they can't be producing that much value. Well, actually, if every user of Google is producing something for Google, then that value needs to be taken into account. And I think actually Google is a massive source of value creation right now through the fact that so many people are using it all of the time. The same thing about Facebook and all the rest of it, that you create the information. So that's the second thing. The third thing is, I think, where you are headed, and I think this is right to ask the question. It's not easy to look at some of these contemporary forms of organization, like Google and Facebook and Amazon and all the rest of it. It's not easy to look at them and say, well, you can simply plug them into Marx's formulation and everything is going to be okay, because I just don't think that's correct. I don't. My first two comments probably make it sound like I'm trying to defend Marx, and okay, you don't have to change anything because he's right, and so I don't want to go there. But I do want to say that there are those elements which I think it's important to take into account. But at the same time, there are some very important issues right now about what is value, how to understand value in the contemporary situation. For instance, what do we produce when we're producing value for Google? We're producing information. Is information value? Is it reasonable? If information is value, then we have to start talking about all kinds of information being value. And what kind of information is value and what is not. But Google's operation, you see, is taking all of that information and then valorizing it. I mean, Marx actually has this interesting kind of language where he talks about the valorization moment. If Google simply took the information and spread it out and said you all can use it, it would not be valorized because it would not be part of the circulation of capital. But what Google is especially specializing in is taking information and valorizing it and turning it into, but that means that you take the information and you turn it into a proprietary form. You commodify it. You turn it into a commodity. Because we, when we're making the information, are not actually making a commodity. We're just using it, and we're prosumers. So it has to be commodified at a certain point, and it's that moment of commodification which allows for Google to say they own this information. And I think it's the ownership of the information that becomes very important. And of course, this is the ownership of something starts to become very significant, like this controversy over the opening of Hudson Yards and what's that crazy thing called, the vessel, or what? Is it called the vessel? Is it? Anyway, I mean, the designers of it say. The shed. No, not the shed. The crazy walk thing, the vessel. Yeah. Well, the designers kind of said, everybody could go on it and do what they want, and then they could take as many photos as they like, but they had a proprietary right for commercial use of any image of it that anybody put on Facebook. So if you took an image and you put it on Facebook, the designers of the thing said they could use it and you couldn't charge them for using it. In other words, but this is a very interesting concept, right? I mean, let's suppose somebody takes a brilliant kind of image and puts it on Facebook. Then the company can come along and take it and turn it into postcards and sell it as postcards or something like that, or sell it on the internet or something like that. In other words, the valorization is not in, Marx primarily looks upon the operation of valorization as being the application of labor in the production of a commodity. But I think there's more to valorization than simply that. There's also the valorization that comes with actually exercising a proprietary right. But that's something that's different and Marx doesn't deal with. And it seems to me that this then redefines the value stream, and it says that anything that is turned into a proprietary right, information, knowledge, or something of that kind, is commodified, then enters into what value is about. So I think that there are some serious modifications. This is the way I would start to look at the problem. But I'm not sure this is far enough, or that it deals with and what the consequences are of saying, well, the exercise of any proprietary right over anything and commodification actually then introduces a value element into. But then the question is, well, how much value is there in the original element that gets commodified this way? So there's a lot of problems with what I'm saying, and I know that. But I think that we need to rethink to some degree what the value theory is about, and what the role of labor is in that, and recognize that these indirect forms of labor are potentially significant within this complex structure.
So my question is related with the last part that you were mentioning about the labor forms. And basically, I was thinking about which is the place of this chapter in the capital as a whole. And basically, one of the questions that I have is how to think the conceptual and categories that he is using to demonstrate a certain development, a certain argument. So if machine is like the capitalist form par excellence, two things. Why is he's not using categories such as abstract labor, for instance? I think that will be interesting to notice that the dialectics of the negative and the positive would change radically if we think in terms of how machine is reproducing or not abstract labor. And in that sense, it would also change the idea of what is socialism. Because if we read this chapter through a Leninist perspective, I think we can find many of his state and revolution arguments of using even like Taylorist technology.
Yeah.
So how to think machinery and even state as such, as within that logic that we should criticize from the previous categories that he's using in the first part of the book.
Right. I think this chapter is based very much on the idea of abstract labor. So I think that would not bother me. What is interesting, however, is this moment where he's kind of saying, the abstract labor structures carry within them the possibility of conversion into something different, where abstract labor would not be the objective of what the machines are about, but something else is going to be involved. So I think that's important. The second point, I can only give my own sort of response to it. And probably most of you will disagree with this. But in the same way that I think that the creation of contemporary capitalism started off having to appropriate the technologies of a preceding mode of production. So I think it's inevitable that any move towards socialism will have to be based on the current technologies. And in in the same way that Marx talks about the reconfiguration of the way those technologies were set up under feudalism, in the transition to capitalism, we can imagine a situation where we would say, all right, we've got the contemporary technologies, can we put them together in a different way for a different social purpose? But there would be no real change in the technologies. And I think to some degree I have a sympathy with Lenin, that he looked to Taylorism and he looked to Fordism as being the superior, industrial forms that could that had the productivity to actually produce the armaments they needed. They want to build tanks, and they needed something. So I have a certain sympathy with the fact that he took over the Fordist structures and said, okay, we're going to use these at the base, as the base. Where I would start to be critical is to kind of say that at a certain point, say around the time when Stalin came in and started doing Stalinist things, around that point, there had been a very interesting period of discussion about new economic policy and all the rest of it. And there was the beginnings of a sort of argument about, well, what kind of alternative technologies would we need to set up? And so I think if there was a failure in the Soviet revolution, it was that it didn't go very far in asking that kind of question. It even got to the point of taking the value theory as a normative requirement, and then set about saying, well, what kind of organizational forms can we set up which within this, what in effect is a capitalist value structure, what kind of communist forms can we set up? And of course they did some very interesting things. I mean, they invented input-output analysis. There are many technological areas where the Soviets were way ahead of even of contemporary capitalism, but at the same time they were not actually really thinking about, all right, what kind of value theory should exist in a socialist society, and what kinds of technologies would be necessary to reorganize productive activity with the aim of, as Marx puts it, creating a realm of freedom in which the realm of necessity has been left behind. I mean, if that would be one of the objectives of a socialist revolution, then the question would be, what kind of technologies do we have that are going to do that? I think that right now there is the real necessity to actually offer a critique of a lot of the capitalist technologies, which have become, I mean, we have an enormous array now of household technologies, for example, which is supposed to be labor-saving and time-saving, but which seem, like John Stuart Mill pointed out, to have exactly the opposite effect. They take up time and they dominate time, and the result is that people don't have free time because they're so busy managing all of these technologies which are supposedly freeing up. And I mean, there's a real critique to be made, and actually there's a parallel to Marx's chapter on technology that I think needs to be written, which is to ask the question: to what degree have we become an appendage of capital in our consumerism? And to what degree, I mean, in other words, taking this and kind of saying, okay, Marx has done this in the realm of production. Maybe we can do the same thing about consumption right now. To what degree I mean, to what degree are we autonomous in our consumer choices? Really autonomous, as opposed to fictionally autonomous in the sense that we can go into a shopping mall and we can choose this shirt versus that shirt, or this brand of toothpaste versus that, or that shampoo versus something else. I mean, tremendous range of supposed choice. But to what degree are we really autonomous? And have we been turned into appendages of a capitalist consumption regime? And when you look at what Marx is saying here, that, okay, this technological dynamism is associated with increasing output and increasing capital. Well, that needs an increasing market. How is that going to be structured? Marx makes the assumption in this volume that there is all commodities exchange at their value, there's no problem in the market. But here he points out, there is a problem. The problem is that you need to globalize the market in order to dispose of this immense amount, this mass of commodities. And if there was a mass of commodities that was crying out for absorption and marketing back in, Marx's time, what is it like now? I mean, again, it would be very interesting to write a chapter like Marx on contemporary consumption and look at that and say, you can just imagine writing a little book and kind of saying, we're appendages of the capitalist consumption machine, and we have no choices about it. We're basically sort of pinned in. And in fact, what's happening is, what has happened is that capital has defined a certain mode of living, a certain mode of everyday life, and certain conditions of everyday life, and you've got to conform to that. And too bad if you don't have sufficient money to do that, because then you're really in a mess. So I think. The whole kind of question of the critique of technology and a critical approach to technology. And remember, in that footnote, Marx kind of said there's not been a proper critical history of technology. And I think, we have now kind of science and technology departments and so on. And the good ones, recognize some of this coming from Marx and have some critique involved, but the critique has become more and more kind of silenced. I mean, technological change is a good thing. What all the big philanthropists do, try to solve the global problem in the world by developing new technologies. And I think, a critical engagement with what technologies are about, and to see technological evolution as actually deeply implicated in the whole dynamics of class struggle. Just simply to take that positionality for a little bit and look at things, and you get a very, very, very critical kind of perspective. I mean, I remember this time when there was all this excitement about the new techniques of production action in the sort of late 70s and early 80s, called flexible specialization. And people were saying, this is great. A lot of people on the left were saying, this is great. Flexible specialization, who can be against it? And one of the things I did in the condition of postmodernity was to say, flexible specialization equals flexible accumulation. And as soon as you look at it as a standpoint of flexible accumulation, you see that actually this whole technological evolution was very much class-biased and class-based, and with class effects, which were the disempowerment of workers. And are workers more empowered now than they were in 1980? No way. flexible specialization did a great job for capital as a form of encouraging flexible accumulation. And that had a technological organizational base. So I think that, you know, these questions of what can be used and and how it can be used, and we still need, I think, perpetual hammering on this kind of question of what is the critical history of technology that we're looking at, and what is the critical perspective that we want to take. Now, Marx's perspective on this is, I think, interesting. You don't want to get into a situation by saying all technology is bad and that every process is bad. You've really got to start to do a critical kind of thing and ask some of these questions which may not be well posed at the end here, which is, okay, what is there going on in all of this which has some sort of opening that we could start to think about appropriating it for a radically different purpose than the purpose to which capital puts it? Is there something going on here? And I would argue, yeah, there's a lot going on which has this possibility. But you can't see it simply as a technological fix. The technology is not going to give you the future. It's going to take something else. But you're not going to get the future without a technological transformation either. Which is why I went over that initial relationship in the footnote, why the footnote is so important. Because in effect, one of the principles you could argue is that until you can insulate technology from the dominant social relation of capital, there is no way that there will be anything coming out of technology that's anything other than contributing to the further accumulation of capital. Maybe it's a bit too deterministic, but on the other hand, as a principle, it's not a bad guiding principle to start there with thinking and then think about modifying the argument. But it's a very interesting kind of set of questions.
Hi. You've talked about your addition of institutional arrangements or institutional organizations as a crucial element to historical materialist analysis. I was wondering how you distinguish those institutional organizational arrangements from social relations, which are already sort of delineated in the elements.
Well, the point I think about all of those elements I'm talking about is you really, at some point, they all sort of fuse into each other. But the way I would look at it is this, is that the field of social relations is one thing. The field of the law, just to take one set of institutional arrangements, is another. And obviously the law tries to codify certain things about social relations, but social relations are much more fluid than the law. And we're seeing a situation right now where a political situation which is very fluid and very dynamic in lots of ways. There's a tremendous desire on the part of many people to stabilize it by saying we should appeal to the rule of law. And then the question arises, well, can you change the law? And how does the law get changed? So institutions, I think, and to the degree that they become kind of solidified and develop, and this is again the point that Marx wants to make, is that when you're looking at institutions, you're looking at something which evolves not necessarily in response to the requirements of social relations or the requirements of production or the requirements of the metabolic relation to nature. It is something that has its own autonomy, an autonomous form, and we have to understand that its own autonomy is such that there will be internal developments within the legal community and within the law, which lead to transformations in practices and all the rest of it. And those transformations are therefore have to be understood not necessarily as a product of a transformation of technology or something else, but as something that's related to. Now, one of the things that's going to happen in the law, for example, is that artificial intelligence is going to play a very important role in legal analysis. That law clerks who go and research, background stuff right now are going to be out of a job. It will all be automated. And there'll be artificial intelligence. And as a lawyer, you want to get, case histories or something like that. You just talk to Fred, the artificial intelligence, and say, give me all of the cases on this. And Fred will go off and do a research, and in 5 minutes we'll give it back to you, which is far faster than a law clerk will do it. So yeah, I mean, the technology will affect the law, but the institution of the law has its own dynamic, and you can say that about the institution of a central bank. That once central banks are set up, they develop their own traditions and their own dynamics, and and then people try to intervene and transform them from outside, as Trump is trying to do. It'll be interesting to see if he can do it, because to some degree the central bank has always been answerable not to the President of the United States or to, even congressional, it's been answerable, to quote the capitalist class, as a class interest. And turning it into something that's answerable to somebody's personal interest is not in the interest of the capitalist class. So it'll be interesting to see how fast and far the capitalist class will go in pushing and saying, these last two appointments you've made to the central bank are not going to be approved. And make clear to the president there's no way anybody of that sort is going to be approved to the... It'll be interesting to see to what degree that happens. But institutional arrangements, yeah, of course, they're about the codification of social relations, and the law has a lot to say about the codification of social relations, but they're changing all of the time, as we know, but the dynamic is of its own sort. So if you I think watching the documentary and the movie about Ruth Bader Ginsburg is kind of interesting this way. I mean, of course it's presented as the great individual who did something, you have to put it that way because that's the only way American audience would absorb it. So but on the other hand, there's a certain persistence about her within the law, kind of when she's confronted with, I don't know what it was, 278 federal regulations which discriminate against women, and she basically said, we're going to take them down one by one, and for 30 years that's what she's been doing. And that is something that's internal within the law. It wouldn't have happened that way if it were not for the fact that, people are on the streets and there was a feminist movement and all these other things, which both movies entirely ignore, apart from the fact that Gloria Steinem is mentioned a couple of times or something. But nevertheless, the story it's told is a very interesting story of a lifetime commitment to the transformation of a body of law. And she obviously did an extremely good job in terms of doing that. And I think that here you see how the autonomy of the legal sector has an important quality to it, so somebody within it can attempt to change it and transform it in certain kind of progressive ways. And I think I think it's an important movie to look at right now, because it says to you, revolutions don't occur overnight. It takes a lifetime of taking each regulation one by one and dismantling it. And of course, it moves backwards as well as forwards. It doesn't. There's no teleology involved here. To keep it going forward is very hard, and of course it's now kind of in a stasis position. No great thoughts about this?
I don't know if this is a great thought or not, but in terms of what you were talking about, using the using the technology that's already existing in order to make a new society, that the new technology is all premised on the most barbaric forms of labor in order to make the plastics, in order to make, to do the mining, to get the
Right.
material and all
Right.
of this,
Right.
that all those people who are so marginalized in order to have the new technology, it seems like the people who are talking about creating a new society based on technology are casting them aside as if
Yeah.
they don't exist.
Yeah. No, I think that's a real issue, and there's this tendency to regard technology as something in itself and of itself, and without taking the implications of what it might mean at all kinds of other levels, which seems to me Marx is suggesting we should be cognizant of in terms of his, this new technological dynamism which we see in Lancashire is actually having disastrous effects on the handicraft industry in India. At the same time as India is being pushed into the sort of becoming a raw material producer for the British textile industry. And what does that mean in terms of the conditions of life and labour of those populations? And I think that this is why I'm saying a critical history of technology is always required, and a critical perspective, always asking these questions: what are the secondary effects of this technology, which is going to improve productivity, and then say, well, you need a bigger market. How do you get the bigger market? Well, people have to stop exercising their own consumer choice, and we have to force them to certain kinds of consumer choices. And same thing about, So I think there's something very significant of that sort. We have about 10 minutes left, and I just want to talk about the next chapter in here, because next time, I'm sort of going to jump ahead a little bit, since our timing is, of the essence, and I want to get into part 6, which is chapter 19. I want to get I want to get into part 7, and I want to next time to talk about chapter 23 and 24. Okay, so we're going to 23 and 24. The next section of Capital is begins with this chapter on absolute and relative surplus value, which is a crucial chapter. So let me just briefly say something about it. So far, we've largely considered the condition of the labourer as being an individual condition. But what Marx does here is to say we have to start to look at the labour process as a collective enterprise. And then he kind of says that the solitary man, on the first page of 643, just as head and hand belong together in the system of nature, so in the labour process, mental and physical labour are united. Later on, they become separate. And this separation develops into a hostile antagonism, essentially with capital dominating the mental functions and with labor left with the purely physical functions. But we also have to consider that the product is transformed through as a joint product of a collective laborer. And we therefore have to consider the condition of the productive labor. In order to work productively, he says at the bottom of the page, it is no longer necessary for the individual himself to put his hand to the object. It is sufficient for him to be an organ of the collective laborer. Now this is a problem. Where does the collective laborer begin and end? In a factory you'll find somebody actually doing the making. There'll be somebody who's cleaning the floor. There'll be somebody who'll be pushing this around. So in a sense what Marx is saying, all of them are part of the value production because they're part of the collective laborer involved. This poses a problem of what happens when capital starts to subcontract services to somebody else. There's a problem about where the collective labour begins and ends. If the definition of productive labour given above, the original definition, is derived from the nature of material production itself, and it remains correct for the collective labourer considered as a whole. But it no longer holds good for each member taken individually. So an individual can be working in a factory and not doing anything that's productive in the ordinary sense of Marx has been describing it, but they're still part of the collective labour, so they're contributing their labour to the collective activity. And then Marx says the concept of productive labour also becomes narrower. Capitalist production is not merely the production of commodities, it is the production of surplus value. The worker produces not for himself but for capital. It is no longer sufficient, therefore, for him simply to produce. He must produce surplus value. The only worker who is productive, says Marx, is one who produces surplus value for the capitalist, or in other words, contributes towards the self-valorization of capital. This is a very special definition of productivity. There's all sorts of labor going on in society, which as far as Marx is concerned is unproductive. And it's unproductive if it does not actually produce surplus value for capital. The only labor productivity that capital cares about is that labor productivity which can be harnessed to the production of surplus value. And Marx says, if we take an example from outside the sphere of material production, a schoolmaster is a productive worker when, in addition to belabouring the heads of his pupils, he works himself into the ground to enrich the owner of the school. So it's interesting. You can get surplus value out of education. That the latter has laid out his capital in a teaching factory instead of a sausage factory makes no difference to the relation. The concept of a productive worker therefore implies not merely a relation between the activity of work and its useful effect, between the worker and the product of his work, but also a specifically social relation of production. A relation with a historical origin which stamps the worker as capital's direct means of valorization. Here comes the big sentence. To be a productive worker is therefore not a piece of luck, but a misfortune. Now this has created a lot of problems, because most people want to be productive. And if you say to somebody you're unproductive, this is kind of considered in our society, in particular, as a deep, deep criticism. What Marx is saying is, actually, to be productive in this society is a misfortune. And this is one of the arguments I had with many feminists back in the 80s, when many of them kind of said there should be, wages for housework. And you kind of say, well, that's nuts. You're trying to make women productive. And they say, yeah, women are productive, and they should be acknowledged as productive. And I'm saying, but don't you understand that to be a productive worker under capitalism is a misfortune? Why are you urging everybody to become productive? So anyway, this is an interesting kind of concept. But it does carry over in certain kinds of ways. Now, to say, this is a very special, this is capital's definition of productivity. It's not my definition or this general social definition of productivity. But we should be clear why it is that Marx is saying that to be a productive worker under capital is a misfortune. And then he goes on to say, oh, he's going to deal with this. There then comes a point where he starts to say, well, there's a thing set up on 645. It requires, he says, a specifically capitalist mode of production which, along with its methods, means and conditions, arises and develops spontaneously on the basis of the formal subsumption of labour under capital. This formal subsumption is then replaced by a real subsumption. This distinction between formal subsumption and real subsumption is very important in Marx's thinking. Formal subsumption is something where you are dominated by capital in the market. So formal subsumption would be characteristic of the manufacturing period. Real subsumption is where you are under the control of capital in the labour process and in the market. Formal subsumption means that you've become an appendage. That's the appendage condition. The formal subsumption. Formal subsumption is characteristic of the putting out system. Okay? Real subsumption is what happens in the factory. In the putting out system, when the merchants took the cloth and asked for, or took the cotton or whatever it was to the peasant's hut and told them to weave it, the peasant is in control of their own labour process. At the end of the month, the merchant will come back and pick up the woven cloth, and if it's satisfactory, pay them, you know. But that's formal subsumption. Real subsumption is when the peasant goes into the factory and the technology and all the rest of it is under the control of the capitalist. So relative surplus value, by and large, is associated with with real subsumption. Absolute surplus value is more characteristic of the real, of the formal. But then Marx goes on to say, actually, this distinction between absolute and relative surplus value is really kind of illusory. You couldn't have a system that's not absolute, where there's no absolute surplus value, because absolute surplus value presupposes a certain technological capacity. Similarly, there's no point in having relative surplus value if there's not also absolute surplus value. So at the end of the day, there's just surplus value. And that's significant. But it's worthwhile distinguishing between absolute and relative, because this distinguishes different strategic possibilities for the capitalist in terms of raising productivity. Do you push for the lengthening of the working day? Do you maximize intensity? Or do you innovate in terms of technology and organizational form? And this is taken up in the next few pages. So read this chapter, and I'll probably come back to it, on absolute and relative surplus value. The other chapters in here are I'll talk very briefly about them next time, but I'm going to skip over them because I want to get to the situation that starts after we've done wages and piece wages and things like that, and national differences of wages. I want to get to the question of simple reproduction and reproduction on an expanding scale. Okay, so I guess we're out of time now, so thank you very much. Let's continue with chapters 23 and 24 next time. Okay?